So this is the closing panel. We've tried to get a diverse panel of experts to give their response really to the whole symposium, not just the last presentations, but really the last 2 days. And we're going to be looking at policy, regulatory, and legislative change going forward. I'll start right in with some brief introductions of our panelists. Merrick is the Executive Director of the Marine Conservation Alliance and President of the North Pacific Fisheries Research Foundation. He served as the Senior Fisheries Economist for Environmental Defense Fund and as Senior Analyst with the Pacific Fishery Management Council. And some of Merrick's recent work has focused on the consideration of risk and scientific uncertainty in the context of National Standard 1 implementation guidelines and deep-sea coral conservation and management in the Bering Sea. Rod Fujita is a senior scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund. He's worked in fisheries management for over 25 years with a focus on the design and implementation of catch shares in marine protected areas, first in the U.S., and more recently internationally in Mexico, the Caribbean, the Coral Triangle, and the EU. Ron also serves as a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Woods Institute for the Environment, where he conducts research on emerging marine conservation issues, including data-limited stock assessment, ocean tipping points and resilience, characterization and control of cumulative impacts, and development of new asset classes and markets for ecosystem services. Steve Joner has worked as a fishery biologist, manager, and advisor for the Makah tribe for more than 35 years. During that time, he has managed tribal fisheries for salmon, halibut, groundfish, and shellfish, as well as recreational fisheries. He's active in the Pacific Fishery Management Council process and has been on a number of committees, including the Trawl Individual Quota Committee, and he currently serves on the Council's Groundfish Advisory Panel. Dorothy Lowman is an appointed member of the Pacific Fishery Management Council representing the state of Oregon and currently serves as that council's chair. As a fisheries consultant, Dorothy works with both industry and environmental organizations on fisheries management issues in both the Pacific and North Pacific regions. And prior to her appointment to the Pacific Council, Dorothy served on the Council's Trawl ITQ Committee, as well as on the Secretary of Commerce's Marine Fisheries Advisory Committee. John Stein is the director of the NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center and is an affiliate professor at the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences and in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health Services. John oversees the work of more than 360 staff members at several facilities in Washington and Oregon, where work informs the management of federal marine resources and protected species and leads the development of new approaches to ecosystem modeling and response to climate impacts such as ocean acidification. And last but not least, André Punt. By now, I'm sure all of you know that André is professor and director at the University of Washington School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences. And most of you know that André's work focuses on providing quantitative scientific advice for fisheries management, including methods for assessing fish and marine mammal populations, risk analysis methods, and management strategy evaluation. But I am sure that very few of you know that a quick review of André's page on ratemyprofessors.com indicates very high scores for helpfulness and for clarity and for overall quality, a markedly lower score for easiness, and an inexplicable failure to earn the red chili pepper badge for hotness. So, we have a lot to process following 2 days of incredibly thought-provoking presentations and discussions. And personally, I'm really struck by the level of our thinking and the sophistication of our discussions about how to make a very effective piece of legislation even better. When just 40 years ago, Bud Walsh, as he described, was arguing to his boss the need to have some sort of management measures in this legislation that would establish U.S. fisheries. But that really describes one of the attributes of the land of Magnuson-Stevens: adaptation, change, improvement, and progress. So the closing panel, Outlook for Policy, Regulatory, and Legislative Change, really focuses squarely on that process. And I've asked our group of panelists to think about how things that they've heard, learned, and debated over the past 2 days resonate with their view of the future, not only in relation to the reauthorization process that will play out over the next few months, but further down the road as well, and in the context of policy and regulation as well as legislation. So with that said, let's start at the top of the order, and I'll go to Merrick for your comments first.
I knew you were going to do that. Yeah, somebody has to go first. My head is completely spinning after those last few talks, spinning in a good way. They're very excellent. But it means that what I had planned out last night is just out the window. But let me start with reactions on ecosystem-based fishery management. I guess my sense is the science is in. There's really no question about ecosystem-based fishery management. I think we rely, as seafood industry users, we rely on a productive system. We need to support that system. We need to think about what we're doing to the system and how it affects us. I don't think there's any debate about that. I think in terms of policy, the question that comes to mind right away for me is, does ecosystem-based fishery management imply a different set of goals than what we're doing right now? And I was listening to these last few talks very intently and trying to figure out if, in the biggest sense of the word, ecosystem-based management means that we need to start changing our goals of domestic yield for the U.S. fishing industry and things like that. My takeaway is that it doesn't really. What I think it does is that it lets us, well, one of the things that I guess I took away is that there's a consistent set of principles or components that make up ecosystem-based fishery management. For instance, there's no question that we need to prevent overfishing. There's no question we need to protect habitat. We need to consider trophic interactions. We need to think about the trade-offs of all of those things. All of those things and thinking about them should help support us attaining our goals better than we're doing now. It doesn't necessarily change our goals. That's maybe my view of the world. So in terms of Magnuson reauthorization and thinking about what that means for new language or whatnot, I guess I'm at a point where it seems like we're not ready to say that there's something new in the act that needs to be done to specify EBFM. I think what we're hearing is that there's a lot of scientific evolution that's happening, but at the same time the act incorporates a lot of these things that we can think of as components of EBFM, like habitat, like preventing overfishing, like thinking about the role of species in the ecosystem. So that's where I'm at. My head is still spinning, so I caveat all of that, but how about I just stop there for now?
Thanks. Let's go to Rod.
Thanks, John. Well, obviously we've had a very thoughtful examination of the successes and failures of the Magnuson Act and how it's been implemented. And one thing that really struck me was that there's a very strong positive correlation between the failure part and my engagement in the Pacific Council process. After I left, there was a string of successes ranging from EFH implementation, the end of overfishing, and really a remarkable degree of discard and bycatch reduction with the IFQ program. With all the success, there's many challenges remaining, and many of our speakers spoke to those. One thing that really was very interesting to me was the dialogue around the mixed stock problem and this question of, do we really know which stocks are unimportant enough to fish more aggressively? And I guess I don't know the answer, but I'm kind of with Selena on this. We have a kind of a bad track record of figuring out what's important and what's not important. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that salt marshes and mangroves were useless swamps unless they were being farmed or turned into charcoal. So I suggest we avoid the hubris. We don't really know. Just because a forage fish may not be, as Tim said, some predators may not care too much if you take one fish out. We need to remember that ecosystem resilience depends on functional redundancy and complementarity. So it's the diversity, it's the spread of different species doing kind of similar things that makes ecosystem states resilient, and we remove those pieces, at our peril. I think a more risk-averse approach and kind of a more risk management way to think about that problem is to use the tools we have that are no regrets, things like catch shares, more transferability, risk pools, co-management, things that we know can extract more of that value that's being left in the water that Chris was talking about without posing more risks. Another big thing that was striking to me was all the dialogue around different kinds of targets moving away from MSY. I think that's really positive. Those targets should reflect more fully our social values. And we heard, I think there's quite a lot of evidence now and a lot of consensus building around the idea that if we keep fishing exploitation rates a little lower, sacrifice a little bit of yield, we can realize a lot of benefits in terms of higher catch rates, lowering fishing costs, lower risk of collapse, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, it was great to hear Sam talk so enthusiastically about the need to understand whole ecosystems and to really address all the major drivers of their degradation. Fishing can only, fishery management can only affect F. It can't really affect B so much. And B really depends on biomass, really depends on keeping the habitats productive. So that's the next big step, I think, in our trajectory, is trying to find new ways to more effectively reduce those drivers other than fishing that are reducing the productivity of these all-important habitats on which all these fisheries and ecosystem benefits depend. Personally, I think we're going to need a new set of tools that also involve new kinds of rights, new kinds of assets, new kinds of markets that value those ecosystem services better, and we'll see where that goes.
Thanks, Rod. Steve?
Thank you. A message for Merrick. It's great to be a Husky. So, I guess what I got out of this was the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good being the successes of the Magnuson Act, and in particular, recent successes and adaptive management at the Pacific Council. The bad being the overfished stocks that caused us so much trouble and so much pain for the last 14 years on the West Coast in particular. And the ugly, well, I'll get to that. It's not the New England fishery, in case you're wondering. But I was encouraged to hear so much about the co-ops, the risk pools, and the co-management this morning, even though I've been around that. To have it presented here today, I guess my personal thought is, what took so long? Those of you who are familiar with the Makah's fisheries know that we've had to deal with that for quite a few years in being able to conduct the tribes, in particular trawl fisheries, with the meager amounts of canary and other overfished rockfish. And one of the things you learn to live with is a scorecard. So for those of you that don't know, the scorecard is the available harvest of each of the overfished rockfish and other overfished species that we have to manage for. So in order to manage for those overfished stocks, we've had to develop time and area management. We've had rolling hotspots, in particular in the Makah's midwater trawl fishery. We've actually had to close the fishery while we developed gear that was more selective, more controllable to allow the fishery to continue on the abundant stocks such as yellowtail rockfish. And then we go out, we test an area before it's opened. And there's minimum bycatch numbers or minimum catch of the overfished stocks before the fishery can be opened. There is a program of, I guess, kind of the carrot and the stick. Fishermen that are able to fish more cleanly with lower bycatch get larger quantities of the target species and and those that can't quite do it are kind of put in a penalty for that period. We've done things such as full retention in our fisheries so that we could be able to count all these rockfish and other fish. Salmon excluders in the whiting fishery. So these things are all very effective. And I think what's needed in, whether it's in this reauthorization or just in the implementation, is the ability to do that more easily. And I think that brings me to the ugly. And the ugly is the NEPA and the 7,000 pages that we've talked about today. The burden that's put on the councils, the agency, the industry, to be able to achieve what they're after is just unnecessary. And I've concluded, in thinking about the 7,000 pages and seeing this repeated over and over, to manage this fishery, what you really need is a good chainsaw, because it's going to take a lot of trees to make all that paper. So if anything needs to be fixed in the Magnuson Act, that's it. And we also heard flexibility. I think that was repeated a number of times, both yesterday and this morning. And that's what we really need, is flexibility.
Thanks, Steve. Dorothy?
Thanks. So one thing that John didn't say about my background is that I have, throughout my career, spent time as staff for 3 different councils. I've been on the side of the table of testifying on behalf of stakeholders at 2 councils, and now I sit as a decision maker on a council, as a council member. And so I think that gives me a really interesting perspective about the diversity between councils and the different roles and the importance of it. And I would say I'm a very strong proponent of the Magnuson Act, the uniqueness and the strength of it, and the way, and in particular the regional councils. So I think I say this to preface my comments as I'm looking at ways that we can make it better. And John said as he started, he sees the Magnuson Act as another symbol of this adaptive management. As we look at reauthorizations, it's again a sort of adaptive process. You know, we've gone through evaluation of how it's working. Now we've reauthorized it a couple times. We're looking for another reauthorization. And as we've gone, we've added in different provisions, and then we've seen how well they've worked. So for example, in this time, we, at least once again, provided, and with a little more clarity about what you need to consider, the ability to do some catch share type management. And we've seen, and we had in these presentations today, some really good examples of what some of the tools from rationalization that can help, I think, in a very effective way, help us better meet the goals of our management programs. Because while I really believe in the council system, and I believe in the transparency and the public process, one thing it is it's not fast. And sometimes the ability to respond for things, to respond to changes, and I think as we see climate change, et cetera, this is just only going to get more important. We're sometimes struggling to be able to adapt, to respond to some of these changes in a timely manner. So I think that I was interested in some of the comments with Joe and others about maybe we ought to think of ways, if we're looking at the Magnuson Act, to encourage people to think about how could co-management help. Not in a prescriptive way, not saying you have to do it, but maybe consider it, how we can use the tools that are associated with cooperative management arrangements to meet our goals and objectives. That doesn't, one of the things that I think I've observed is we've required fishermen to adapt quickly. You know, I mean, they're going to be out of business if they don't learn about how to adjust and try to use some of these new arrangements. But we've had less, maybe incentive for some of them, including me, who's turning gray, and have been used to a certain way of managing, which was more of a command and control, to change our ability to think about different ways of doing things. And so providing, say, just to consider how this could help us to do a better job, I think could help us also evolve in this way. The other thing that, you know, I think we've had a lot of talk about, certainly Chris and and Don both made a lot of comments, and so I don't want to belabor this issue of NEPA in terms of, again, timeliness. But I think one thing that maybe wasn't stressed as much, and we talk about bringing some things into the Magnuson Act that are requirements to have full range of alternatives, have good environmental assessment, is that I actually think it's a possibility that will actually, it's not that we're trying to get out of NEPA, but I actually think this will enhance our ability to effectively meet the intent of NEPA. Because it concerns me sometimes, because of the timing disconnect, that there are sometimes alternatives developed in NEPA documents that never really were considered by the council in their decision making. So I think by kind of front-loading that a little bit, getting that in, having that as part of the NEPA the MSA process in a more robust way, that will actually improve our ability to meet the intent to have that full public process and public transparency and engagement. Finally, I mean, I liked a lot of what was said by Rick and really Steve and Chris to some extent about, multi-species management, and Rick in particular about thinking about, is there a way to phase in response when we're trying to, look at ways to assess these data poor and data moderate stocks, and sort of phase in the management response, because there is uncertainty in that, but it has real life implications when you use it. And I think our trend is just the opposite. We tend to say, okay, we're going to try to make sure we have the appropriately structured complexes, and they'll contribute to a complex OFL and ABC. But there's been a tendency to start, even though we have this complex, to try to start managing at this at the individual species level. And I don't think that's the approach we need to go. So one of the things that John and I were talking about, though, finally, is Does this all have to happen in the Magnuson Act, or are really these some of the things that should be looked at in the guidelines? And I feel that a lot of these things can be done in the guidelines, and maybe we should look also at some of the court interpretations and see if they are maybe meaning that we need to refine these guidelines in the language. There was a recent one on carryover that, or just a quote out of the decision of the court was that Congress didn't define annual catch limits, and the service's definition is manifestly unhelpful in trying to decide whether you should allow and they denied the ability to have carryover. So maybe that's an opportunity for us to look at how we revise these, and I would like to see some of the proposed revisions before we do finish reauthorization, because it's easier to redo guidelines than it is to reauthorize Magnuson. So I think that would help kind of narrow what we need to do in Magnuson.
Thanks, Dorothy. John?
Okay. Thank you. I think I'll start with a little context that we all started to hear here, is that the MSA, the Magnuson Act, is working. It has been a success. And so as I think we've heard, at least on the left coast here, we don't see the need for large-scale change. And I think there's a lot in there that gives us the latitude to do things and make changes through policy and guidelines. With the big asterisks, like, as Sam put, we have ended overfishing. So another example of success. And I think the key point that a number of people have made here already, and we've heard, is that this is a process and not a point estimate. And the value of that process, I think, has been exemplified. It is a real example of adaptive management, which isn't out there that often. But the connection with that, or the need for that, is the investment that has to occur. It's science-based. You need the investment in the science. You need the investment in the process. So it's not cheap, but is it expensive? Well, it's effective. Therefore, it seems like it's a good investment to me. So some of the things that I see from a science perspective is that, yes, ending overfishing has worked by regulating fishing, but as Rod just mentioned, that's not everything. Other factors are controlling rebuilding of stocks at times. Ecosystem productivity change appears to be a driver in places. We've heard issues about blue crab and the pribilophs where they're just not moving. Pacific Ocean perch that Steve mentioned. There's something else out there controlling this. So we need more understanding of that. I think Ann made a great case of how we need to look at climate to better understand how that forces our key stocks. And Selena made a good point about what we need to do and improve our knowledge of habitat, both on the quality side and the quantity side, and how it affects productivity. And also, you've heard me say yesterday, and I think this is really important, is that we don't have enough information or knowledge about the genetic stock structure of all our stocks that we care about. And that's going to be really important. If anything we've learned from salmon, life history is really important to build in resilience. And if you don't understand that life history diversity, and if you don't understand the stock structure, you can lose something that's critically important. So also moving forward, and some of you may think this, may not agree with me on this one, but I think we need to take the full definition of fisheries management. And I mean, that means including both the capture and the captive fisheries. We've heard a lot about the global markets. We've heard some about food security. We've heard about human population growth. And I would contend that the science of culturing fish has made remarkable advances recently. So I think we need to embrace the captive fisheries as part of fisheries management as well. And the final thing, and maybe it's because Tim and Ann and others were all together at a Pisces meeting thinking about the future, which is the name of our science program, and the value of that international cooperation and coordination when it comes to the science side, and as we heard with IUU issues, on the management side is critically important. We've learned a great deal on the science side about how climate affects fisheries by comparing notes across the Pacific Rim. And I think those interactions have, which were well summarized at one level by Tim's talk, has come about from that international cooperation. And I think the investment in that international side of things is not adequate if we're going to make more progress. The world's getting smaller. Our fisheries and our markets are even more connected. And I think we just, that international cooperation and science and management side can be of value to the future.
Thanks, John. And André?
Yeah, I feel weird to be the science geek at this point, and not being hot, which is, I'm going to really struggle with that. I think to put a little bit of the conference in the Symposium in context, the Bevan series is the Bevan series for sustainable fisheries. That's, at least I think that's what the title is. And what we always aim with the Bevan series is to see the problem, but not to give up. And I think the one thing that's come through this conference, or the Symposium, really well is not just that the Magnuson-Stevens Act provides the context to succeed. I think the successes we're seeing through the application of the Magnuson Act are definitely things that the US can be extremely proud about. I work in many places around the world, and the fact that overfishing is essentially eliminated is not something that, you know, essentially any other nation in the world can lay claim to, including places like Kamala, which are supposedly the ecosystem-based management system of the world. So I think we should look as well where we are as where we're going. The second thing that I've taken from this conference, and when I joined the Pacific Council, I think it was just off the wheel was invented. It was a real revolution to be able to take a wheel instead of having to push, you know, the logs and things to get to the meeting. Was that someone said, "Welcome to the council family," and I went, "I don't understand this." And someone explained to me that what it meant was that, yeah, we fight, but we're a part of one family. And I think what's come through and what I've seen in the conference is that that spirit is very much in this room. There are a lot of people with very diverse backgrounds, very diverse aims and objectives. But the way everyone seems to be working together to get to the ultimate goal of sustainable fisheries is, again, something that I guess particularly this coast and even Alaska should be duly proud of. And again, it's an unusual thing to see. In terms of what I've seen and what I think where we need to go to, I think like everybody else, I think the Act is working. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is a really good strategy. But at the same time, I think the guidelines of how we can implement some of these provisions can be improved. And I think some of the things we saw from Rick yesterday in terms of interpreting don't overfish in a slightly more pragmatic and, dare I say, scientifically appropriate manner. So in many of the things that we write down when we define policy, we write it down as if the science is perfect. And Steve had probably my favorite slide, which, if you remember, was a slide that had a whole bunch of lines on it, which were the biomass trajectories for the most data-rich stock on the West Coast. The range of biomass estimates was something like, I think, 400,000 to 4 million tons. That is the range of scientific uncertainty. And so when we say, well, maybe we can overfish by 1%, we need to put it in the context of that. That's not to say that you should not continue to overfish, but we need to look at the implications in a more holistic manner. And I think we can do that and achieve the same goals without going crazy. I do think an emphasis on F rather than B. I think B, biomass, has been really important in terms of defining whether a stock is overfished, and I think that's got to continue, and in terms of setting initial targets. But by following exact trajectories, dare I say, those of us who do stock assessments probably believe our results less than the lawyers who seem to read the output from those reports. And I think, again, you can achieve the goals, and I think a lot of what Rick showed us yesterday goes in that direction. The same applies with the mixed stock exemption. There are ways to achieve the goals, the aims, the spirit of the Act without following nuances in science that are essentially quirks of a modeler at 2 o'clock in the morning who hasn't had too much coffee. Finally, EBFM. I once called myself an eco-skeptic. This was probably when Eurosceptics in the UK were relevant. That doesn't mean much to this audience. And what I was really trying to say again is we need to be really careful not to overinvest, given a fixed budget, in EBFM technology. Going back to the origins of, in fisheries assessment, we've got the Pope, the Shepherd, and the Prophet Daniel. 3 stock assessment guys, one of which is Daniel Pauly. If you've got nothing else to do, you can find out who the Pope and the Shepherd are. And the Shepherd once said that fisheries is like forestry, except the fish are invisible and they move. Okay? And there's a lot of truth to that. And so when you look at that, you say, what are the things we really need to understand? The first thing you need to understand, before you understand the implications of climate change, is how many fish do we have? And so we should not lose sight of the fact that if we can't count the fish, it sort of doesn't matter if we know what its diet is and what its maturity schedule is. So to focus on, what are the things we really need to make the system operational. The final comment I'd like to make, and that goes back to Tim's presentation, showing a simplicity of control rule, even for a complicated system like a forage fish. A constant F strategy can get you very far. Let's not overcomplicate our world. Not only can we not produce the science, we can't explain the complexity.
Thank you, André. So I have some questions, but I would first like to give all of you the opportunity to briefly respond, either to amplify or challenge things that you've heard from your panel colleagues.
So I shouldn't do this. I shouldn't. Maybe he's the prophet, so I shouldn't challenge the prophet, right? So I totally agree that we need to know how many fish are out there. I'll go back to the other part. It depends also how many they are, how productive they are, their spatial structure, and their diversity. So it's just not the number. That's all I'm going to say.
Start with the number and build from the number.
Thank you. I agree.
Rod, did you have, okay. Any other comments, challenges? So I'm going to go back to a few of the highlights from the many great presentations that we heard. And yesterday, Margaret Spring talked about the marketplace of ideas and creating that marketplace through basically the use of science and policy reports mandated under the Act as a way to move the discussion of new issues and new challenges forward, and in some cases, sort of preparing for the discussion and even the next reauthorization. So my question to you is, if you were writing the next discussion draft, what studies, what reports do you think would be really valuable to move forward a discussion without necessarily implementing new regulations? Any takers?
you an NRC report. I've been after something for the last 20, 30 years, particularly in the context of EBFM. To my mind, one of the greatest successes of what we've done is implemented control rules. So if it's as simple as when we're providing advice as an SSC, we are told what the biomass is, we review the assessment, and we can read off a way to provide advice to the council. How do we read off the graph when we're doing EBFM? That's what I want to see. So how do we put all that ecosystem science in a way that I can, or the council can look at the results and say, if temperature is 16 degrees rather than 15 degrees, this is what it means. We've made progress with Pacific sardine, where in fact our control rule for Pacific sardine is directly related to environmental data. What I'm not seeing is that step across the broad spectrum of EBFM issues.
Yeah, that's great. I guess a similar comment. I was really impressed by what Tim had to present. Similarly, posing the question, just because the ecosystems are complex, does that mean the management has to be complex? It's a really interesting way to think about it. And I look forward, I think this report that kind of explores these ideas that you presented here and actually succeeds in coming up with simple control rules that work, at least in a management strategy evaluation sort of a way, would be extremely useful. It would be a way to head off unnecessarily cumbersome and highly data-intensive programs that may not be necessary.
Other ideas? So, moving along then, something that Sam brought up in his presentation was, are there feasible strategies to export not only our nation's seafood, but our ability to manage fisheries successfully and sustainably internationally? And what tools might be available, not necessarily through the Magnuson Act, but through either through other legislation, other efforts to promote those management strategies.
Yeah, I am devoting much of my time now to trying to do that and to export some of the lessons that we learned in the United States to other countries, particularly, well, the EU can stand to learn a lot from the US experience about limiting flexibility around fishing mortality and rebuilding schedules, that sort of thing. In the developing country context, though, where I spend much of my effort, it's hard to imagine transplanting a very complicated regulatory scheme that requires a huge amount of institutional capacity, scientific capacity, and resources. I mean, we're always complaining about lack of capacity here, but when you land in Belize and you find out that there's no catch data of any kind, and no length composition data of any kind, and one patrol boat for the entire country, that's a whole different place to be. And so I think what occurred to me when Sam said that is that there's very high-level principles and lessons that we've learned about getting fisheries management done here, about the degree of flexibility to apply, the importance of hard catch limits, the importance of secure fishing privileges to create incentives for stewardship. Those kinds of things can be exported and then tailored to be culturally appropriate and institutionally relevant.
Dorothy?
So I had the opportunity last year to help facilitate an exchange between some Mexican hake fishermen and managers, and U.S. fishermen and managers. And one of the things that they said they took away was, they have a system that's pretty much just national, pretty much top down. But they were beginning to have these sort of more regional management bodies, organizations. And they really responded to this concept of bringing in this sort of council family approach, bringing in stakeholders, bringing in that knowledge the stakeholders have, as well as bringing their scientists to interact with the stakeholders and have that, and also have the states have a bigger role, so that there was that regional component in a way that they could also then have a different relationship with the federal government in that. And so I think they weren't going to try to do a whole kind of the level that we do, but they were able to take some of these concepts that I think are really important. So I'm trying to keep in touch with them and see how that,
So I'll go back to my last comment. I mean, I think being involved with Pisces, North Pacific Marine Science Organization, for a long time. When I first got involved, I didn't know if I was going to make it. The level of understanding of what is science on the other side of the Pacific was very different way back in the day. And just the value of seeing a whole next generation of students from Asian countries that had gone to either Australia or the US or Canada and been trained, and then starting to assume leadership positions, you start to see the influence of that science on their management. So I think you need to start by, at one level, training the next generation in the science of fisheries, oceanography, of stock assessment, and that will, I've seen it happen, become part of their system. So.
I want to follow up on what Dorothy said. Certainly they need the science. One thing I don't think we would want to export is NEPA. But again, I want to go back to what I was talking about, the co-ops and so on, and what we did at the Makah tribe. We did it out of necessity, but we didn't have to go through any 2-3 council meeting process to do this. So, we need to make it easier for us to do that here. And I think fishermen could really relate to that, to the idea of rather than a top-down approach, more of a local, getting forming co-ops and letting the fishermen answer these questions. The industry really knows a lot more than the managers do about where the fish are, how to catch them, when to catch them. I heard an interesting thing on the radio about UPS. Their truck drivers, when they plan their routes, they plan not to make left-hand turns. And that way, they don't have to sit waiting and burning fuel and wasting time. So EPA didn't tell them to do that. The truck drivers and the company, they came up with that on their own. A very simple solution that saves them time and money. So you carry that example into the fishing industry, into not only the US, but these other countries. It's a very simple concept of being able to utilize the co-op idea, the things that we've learned here, that fishermen can avoid some of these problems by incentives, by implementing their own knowledge rather than being told to do it.
Dorothy, did you have some comments?
So I also think that, we do interact and are part of international regional management bodies. And councils have, on the Western Pacific, Western Central Pacific Commission do have a commissioner seat. Actually, I recently was appointed as the alternate for that council-related commissioner seat. And we've been talking a lot, and how do we bring some of our concepts of precautionary management frameworks into that effectively and use our experiences here to help promote that type of thing. I'm obviously not done it yet. It's a difficult arena, and I'm not naive about that, but I do think there's some opportunities there too.
So co-management has come up a little bit in this panel discussion, and I was struck this morning by the fact that we heard quite a range of recommendations about the need to address co-management in legislation or in regulation. And the West Coast and the North Pacific has really been sort of the cutting edge for developing co-management strategies. And so I'd like to explore this idea a little bit more about the relationship between formal governance and really implementing co-management strategies. Is there a need to support or augment our ability to implement co-management strategies in the Act or in regulation. Are there currently impediments to co-management strategies in our regulations or in the Magnuson Act? But I'd like to explore this idea of what are the next steps to advancing co-management, and what are the new frontiers for improving management with that strategy?
You know, John, I don't really know whether they're, I mean, I'm a big fan of co-management. I think the Morro Bay example is illustrative of the powerful benefits that can come with that. And Joe gave a terrific talk about other cooperative types of management. We see it happening in developing countries too, where there's kind of a lack of central governance capacity, so it gets devolved kind of almost by default to local stakeholders. And if there's enough social capital and leadership, it can really work very well. But I just don't know what to say in response to that question. Are there impediments? I don't know. It seems like if people want to do cooperative management, they do it. I would say that, you know, when I was trying to get the EFP with Eric Feller and TNC through to create this mini cat share for the Morro Bay folks, it was a very involved and quite difficult process. I'm not sure that it's necessary anymore. Can anybody tell me the answer to that? Are there impediments to that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think there are impediments, but it's not something you can legislate to correct. And I think an impediment is just lack of trust. And you know, Dave Soanes made that clear this morning, that we were thrown into co-management following the Bolt ruling in 1974. The tribes were. Trust me, there was not a lot of trust between the state of Washington and the tribes. It took many, many years to develop that, and you know, it's an ongoing thing. We're still working on that, and then it took even longer to develop that level of trust between the tribes and the National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA. And when you have a turnover of people leave, you have to be able to continue that. So, you know, what I see developing in the Pacific Council is this level of trust. Being on the Groundfish Advisory Panel now, I'm impressed with the knowledge and the commitment to good management from the industry representatives on there. And so to me, that's the impediment, is you have to develop that trust, and it's a two-way thing. Both the managers and the industry have to be willing to put that trust in the other, and then you learn as you go.
Merrick and then Dorothy.
So I think I'm about to say pretty similar comments to what Steve just indicated. And I think, you know, if you look at the legal framework, I don't know if there's really a legal impediment to co-management, at least to the degree that I'm envisioning in my head. I guess my instincts tell me there's probably something we can noodle on, but I'm not an attorney. But what I do see is just a need for a cultural shift in our thinking. And you know, as a former agency person, council staffer, I'm used to this thinking of top-down, and we tell the industry what to do and what stakeholders to do and make decisions. And shifting away from that takes some time. And observing this process in the North Pacific Council, I thought Joe did a really good job of laying out the process there, where there's gotten to be a dialogue between the council and the stakeholders. The council has the final word, but they're saying, hey, stakeholders, we want you to do something like this for leasing. We want you to do something like that for bycatch. And the council can always say, we don't think that was sufficient, we're going to do it for you. But you're seeing this this dialogue happen that's very progressive, and I think it's slowly evolving into greater and greater capacities in what we consider to be co-management.
Dorothy.
Yeah, I do think, and that's sort of what I was trying to get to, is I do think it's a cultural shift. And I think that that we change the rules on the fishermen, and they have to react pretty quickly to start to adapt to some of these new ways. But I do think that we aren't quite as clear now that I think the North Pacific is furthest along on this. And you know, we benefited in some of our fishermen who went to the catch share that they had also participated in co-ops and other things in the North Pacific, so they brought that knowledge in their ability to share, et cetera. And also the and then other fishermen have done it, but we have less experience in our managers and our councils with it. So it does take a little bit of time and a little bit to know, and maybe to start to do some cross-council communications of how do you do this, figuring out what performance standards are, and what kind of hammer, and how do you do these creative things, and kind of looking at these, because it's new. I mean, you see it also as we start to think about electronic monitoring. I mean, I've heard Sam talk a lot about maybe we should be in the role of creating some good performance standards, but let other people deliver it. But that's not been our model. And so we don't have a lot of experience in doing that. And so, I think maybe going back to what kind of report would you like to see? Maybe some analysis of how those have been used around the world, and as well as here, might be helpful as we move forward.
Thank you. So I have one more question, and then I'm going to give folks a chance for a sort of parting word or closing comments. And in reference to those closing comments, I'd really encourage you to think about the fact that one of the first things we heard yesterday was the legacy that the University of Washington has in the history of federal fisheries management and Magnuson. And thinking about how does that legacy move forward, what's important for this institution to continue that legacy both on a scientific and on a policy basis. Before we go to those final comments, I want to refer to something that Don McIsaac said this morning. He referred to the wall of science in the sense that there was not feedback to the SSC. Once they had sort of delivered their recommendation, there was no feedback to the SSC. And I found myself wondering whether that's a good thing or whether it's a bad thing. And I'm just going to ask whether there are times when that wall has to come down in order to solve certain challenges. Are there times when policy and science can't be separated, and what might some of those scenarios be?
So I will see if I'm interpreting Don's comment correctly. But so yes, the wall of science. In the National Marine Fisheries Service, we have the wall of science between the management side of the house and the science side of the house. But we have really strong communication between that wall. And I think that's the value, is that the managers are not questioning the science that we give. They may have questions as we develop it, and they may give us advice that we should consider to develop that advice. But once it's done, it is the science to be used, and then they take it forward and use it in the context of making policy. So yes, it's a wall, and I think it's a valuable wall, because it makes sure that people understand where does the science start, where does the science stop, and where does policy making then happen.
André?
Yeah, I live in the wall. In the wall. The thing with the wall is you can shout over the top, right? You can definitely communicate over the wall, but what mustn't, there's two problems that can arise, and the wall is meant to defend you against both. One is, and it's one of my favorite stories, I don't know how many years ago, we were doing a hake assessment, and there were 3 states of nature about future recruitment, good, medium, or bad. And the council was presented with a decision table, if you do this, this will happen. And they decided, instead of choosing one of the management actions, they said, we want high recruitment. Right? Which I don't disagree with. I mean, it's just that really wasn't one of the options that the council, and the council is important. I don't want to, you guys are good, but yeah. So in that sense, the wall tells you that you can't choose the state of nature. That's not available. So there is the desire of the council for the SSC, for example, to change the science to achieve some goal. And I don't think we've seen that on the West Coast, certainly since I've been there. The other one, which in some sense from the science side is almost more important, is when scientists start to behave like policy people. So I'll tell you a story. I come from Africa back in the day, and our decision makers, they had control rules, which was whatever you get given from the scientists, take the highest number, okay? And so if we gave them 3 quota options, they'd give you the highest one. So how do we do that? How do we solve that problem? Instead of giving high, medium, and low, we'd used to give them very low, low, and medium, because then we knew that they'd take medium. right? Which is what we wanted to take in the first. So what we were doing was we were being the policymakers, and we were deciding how precautionary the decision makers need to be. So the wall of science is protecting the decision makers against scientists who might think they should be decision makers and know more. So I think the wall is a little, it's a wall that's protecting both sides against each other, or against themselves, actually.
Merrick.
Yeah, I appreciate these prior two comments, and I guess my response is a little bit different. I think the wall of science is good in that I don't think policymakers should be questioning the science. And we have, National Standard 2, best available science. That's not the job of the council. I think a feedback loop should exist for certain instances, though. And I think as we look forward to things like EBFM, as we learn more and we think about these trade-offs that Tim was expressing in his presentation, I think he asked the question, if you remove this many sardines or this many forage fish and has this effect on seabirds, that's science, that's a trade-off. But it doesn't tell you what to do about it. So you can imagine that going to the council and the council saying, we think we want this, but we also want this, this, and this. We have all these trade-offs. Tell us what it means at the end of the day. There's a feedback loop. And I think that type of a process is going to be necessary if we want to engage in these types of activities where the benchmarks are not clear, the goals are not clear, and instead it's more of an iterative thing. But it's not about questioning the science, it's about a discussion with the scientists.
Dorothy, a last comment on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think the other piece that's really important about that wall of science and trying as much as possible to keep science and policy separate and identify separately is that we're asking fishermen often to take some pretty hard hits. And I think they've been willing to take it and accept this as best available science. But if they think there's a lot of messing around and a lot of policy before being made, and some of them still think that, but in general, I think there's been an acceptance of that, an acceptance of some pretty hard sacrifices, as someone mentioned, because of that. And if you start to blend those too much, I think you're going to lose that.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask for closing comments. If you have thoughts about what will be required of the next generation of leaders in fisheries science and fisheries policy, please share them. If you have other thoughts or closing comments.
Can I give a budget? You can. Do I get the green one? Well, I'll start. Obviously, the mission of this school has been since, 1919, David? You're the... Thereabouts. Somewhere, yeah. B0 for most of us, way before even New England was totally depleted. It is the mission of the school to educate and to provide the next set of leaders. And I think I personally, just at this point, would like to express my gratitude towards NOAA. I mean, we've developed a really good partnership with NOAA. We've also developed that same partnership with industry, with NGOs, and that's where we see our role in the future, is to train that set of scientists, not that necessarily they have any particular path, but they're trained to move into the fields that are going to be developing as we move forward. And I think the other thing that I'm seeing in this meeting is the need, and that we're starting to address as well through, for example, a course that Penny and Dave, who has woken up, are giving, is training our natural scientists to understand more of the policy, and hopefully more of the policy people to understand the science, so that the wall of science may eventually eventuate, but at least the people who are now operating in that world can see both sides of the fence.
Thank you, André. John?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up. So it was 1919 then when the school was started, and then it was 1931 or 1932 when the Montlake Lab was built, and they transferred a scientist up from California, Stanford, for the specific reason to be close to the school. And that partnership and basically has, gone through the years, and I think it's been very reciprocal advantage for everyone. And I think as we go forward and look to the future, I think the idea of blurring the lines, not in a negative way, but through interactions of the natural sciences and the social sciences, are going to be incredibly important. As I say at times, one more piece of data usually isn't going to sway an argument. or help make a decision, but getting people to listen and talk and understand each other, the anthropologists and the social scientists, sociologists, can give us a lot to move decision-making perhaps forward when it's contentious. And I think what Dorothy, brought up is that building that trust. If you don't have the trust, and you're not going to get very far. And that trust can come from both cooperative research and cooperative management in one way.
Other thoughts? Dorothy?
I'll speak to the legacy of the University of Washington relative to the Magnuson Act. I, along with many others, my cohorts were sent off by the College of Fisheries back then to the Bering Sea in 1976, immediately after the enactment of the Magnuson Act. And we went aboard. I was on a Japanese mothership in the Bering Sea. And so we were the first bunch of observers. And that was really the start of the U.S. implementation of the Magnuson Act. I learned a lot there. And I've met a lot of, again, a lot of colleagues who got their start there. And I firmly believe that anybody who's been an observer is going to make a good biologist or a good manager. So, I think that was a smart thing to do. And there are a lot of us out there that got our start that way. So that, to me, is the kind of the foundation of the legacy.
Thank you, Steve. Dorothy?
I'm actually an alum, but of a particular part. I mean, it's gone through as many changes as I think LAPS and DAPS have done. But it was the Institute of Marine Studies when I started. And it was one where you really focused as an interdisciplinary approach. And I actually came as an oceanographer, not as a biological person. I wasn't, as everyone said, oh, isn't it nice that you're a marine biologist? No, I was a chemical oceanographer. And, but I really focused on the social sciences over there, because that was what I didn't know, and learning how to all put these all together. And I think when I went to my first job as a staff person, when people would ask me what I do, I said, I think partly what I am is a translator, because I learned enough about how to help people speak across disciplines. And if I really needed an economist, even though I was the socioeconomist for the council, I'd hire a real one. But I knew how, I knew enough to know how to ask the right questions and know how to frame the questions. So I think that this is an incredible service, and I don't want, I kind of want to recognize that part of the school too. And what I think, Jean Flem, I think, was a graduate too. And I look in the audience, and there are a number of other people who are playing really important roles in fisheries management now. I think the other great service it does is to do things like this Bevan Symposium. While I was sort of around for most of the development, 76 I was still going on oceanographic cruises, but by 81 I was here at the school, and I followed through this. And while I might know it was great to hear some of the particular war stories, including, Bud's chiseling the commandments of the national standards over the weekend. In general, I knew the whole history and the institute, but I also realized that there are people and students in this audience who were in grade school when a lot of that happened, or maybe even younger. And I think that it's really important to have these opportunities to bring that history together. And it was helpful for me to remember, because I would quit. People who knew me, I'd quit every 5 years after I was fully vested in retirement, take the money and go try to figure out what I want to do when I grow up, because it was just too frustrating how long it took to ever get anything done. But when you look back now over all these years, we really have accomplished a lot, and I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be involved with management under the Magnuson Act. And so I really encourage, and I think that this school plays an incredible role in that.
Thanks, Dorothy. Merrick?
So, I'm a beaver. I'm not even a husky.
At least he's not a duck.
And I'm not the only one, I know that. But
She got a degree at UW as well.
Yes.
This is a phenomenal institution, and just the having the science centers around and the industry and the commission, and creates a synergy that I think you just can't duplicate anywhere else. And it's really a wonderful thing, and what's going on here is just great. I'm also an economist, so I'm going to assume that you asked me a different question. So what I was struck by over the last couple of days is that the history of the Act is really centered around domestic yield for the fishing industry, maximum sustained yield as a scientific principle. These are all things that people understand, that are pretty transparent, It's easy to communicate them. But we're in a paradigm now where we're moving into more complicated sets of questions and things where the goals and objectives are not so clear. I think EBFM is a great example on these principles of forage and trade-offs and all of these things. And so if we're going to then be engaging in a stakeholder-driven process, communication and understanding is really, really key. And so the question I'm sitting here asking myself is, how do we start to create tools where the scientific community can communicate with the stakeholders and the stakeholders understand it and can respond back? What I can envision is institutions like this creating an army of people that can go out and do management strategy evaluations and say, here's a couple of scenarios, this is what this means, what do you think? And people start to understand that. They understand outcomes, they understand things. They don't understand, sigma squared over R necessarily. And I certainly don't understand what that means anymore. But I think, scenario-based tools that people can use and understand and talk about in a policy setting, I think that's something we should be striving to do more of and trying to educate incoming graduate students in the future. So.
I don't want to put you on the spot, Roger.
That's okay. I just want to reiterate what Dorothy said. I think, we all agree that we prefer a state of nature that produces high recruitment. I think we can all agree that the University of Washington has produced an outstanding set of cohorts of marine scientists and policy experts who have contributed immeasurably, really, to the success of Magnuson Act, and that's its legacy. Also, I really appreciate the fact that the University and the Bevan series creates this forum for this really high-level, very impressive, very constructive dialogue that I'm sure will produce a lot of insights that will help the legislation continue to adapt to current realities.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking the panel for their comments and enduring my questions. And I think David
always has the last word.
No.
Where's the Hawaiian shirt and the ukulele?
Very quickly, to pick up on Tim's observation regarding graduate students flocking to a rare box lunch, Bill Clark, who is at least the stature of a dean, was seen walking away with 6. But then again, he told us yesterday he's unemployed. Yeah, he's unemployed. Just several times during the 8 months of preparation for this, I fell very deep into the weeds, and I wondered how the topics, the agenda would finally play out. It felt like the wiring diagram you showed, and I just want to congratulate all the members of the steering committee and the session panels for persistence and patience in putting together what has turned out to be just a spectacular, fabulous forum the last 2 days, and especially how astute they were in picking the speakers who were insightful, articulate, provocative, and meeting one of the major criterion of the Bevan series were just downright entertaining at times. So I think we should thank you all. And travel safe and keep doing good work.
Oh. One more, two more thank yous. David McGovern, where is he? Stand up, David. McGowan. And last, but at very least, the chair of the steering committee, without whom we would not be here, the man himself. Travel safe, and thanks for attending.